Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott. I'm here today to give you my video review of the new Tamron 17-50mm. This is an f4 Di3, meaning it's designed for mirrorless, and it has their VXD focus motor. More on that in just a moment. A few months ago, I did a review of Sony's 20-70mm f4G lens. And the premise behind that lens was taking essentially a standard zoom, 24-70mm, and stretching it back a little bit to the 20mm point to allow some crossover into the wide angle space. And the idea kind of proposed by Sony was that, you know, with modern high resolution bodies, I primarily shoot at a 61 megapixel resolution point, and my other Sony camera is a 50 megapixel camera. There's a lot of capacity there for cropping to get more reach, but of course, all the resolution and cropping ability in the world doesn't get you wider. And so their idea is that if you can stretch this, it allows you more flexibility. Tamron has kind of taken that same idea, except for kind of approaching it from the other end. And rather than taking a standard zoom and stretching it a little bit back into the wide angle, they've taken essentially a wide angle zoom and stretched it out at least into normal range at 50 millimeters. But of course, going even wider. And so if you can compare 17 millimeters achievable by the Tamron with the 20 millimeters achievable by the Sony, you can see that there's a significant difference in the framing there. And so if you're in a tight space, being able to go even wider could be potentially even more useful than that additional 20 millimeters on the telephoto end of the lens. Now, Tamron already had a very good, very well received 17 to 28 millimeter f2.8 lens. It cost about $100 more than what this lens does, but it does have that faster maximum aperture. At the same time, however, this new zoom benefits from coming in their G2 or second generation phase of development. So it really has the same level of build and feature set, which is at a higher level than what that earlier 17 to 28 millimeter lens had. So this is really, in many ways to me, it's a great lens for stills, but it makes even more sense for video. It's an internally zooming lens, so it means it achieves a constant balance point. It is fairly feature rich when you dive into the ways you can customize it. It has extremely good autofocus, and it has a price point of just $699 US. The chief complaint I got from you as the audience about the Sony 20 to 70 millimeter was that it was overpriced at about $1,100. So this comes in at $400 cheaper, which is going to make it, I think, quite interesting for a lot of potential buyers. So is it worth buying? Well, we'll dive into that in detail right after a word from our sponsor.
Who doesn't love getting a parcel in the mail? But what if that parcel showed up once a quarter with up to 4 surprise gadgets inside? Everything from Bluetooth headphones to security cameras or wireless chargers. It's the joy of discovery, like finding that what I thought was just another boring Bluetooth speaker was actually a killer little pod that is easy to take everywhere and pumps out a surprising amount of sound. Or maybe it's discovering a native HQ wireless charger that turns out to be the perfect match for my phone. The Mini Boom 2 and native HQ charger are just two of the items from the Everyday Tech box, while the optional Smart Home box includes a smarter smart bulb that can be wirelessly controlled, along with a cool little security camera that sends a feed right to my phone. There's even an optional health box that contains cool gadgets like a Smoothie 2 portable blender. Each box contains $125 plus worth of killer gadgets, but costs less than $90 a box on average. And you can save an additional $20 off your subscription by clicking the link in the description and using code DustinAbbott at checkout. Give that gadget lover in your life a gift they'll really love by gifting them with Gadget Discovery Club.
So as noted, this is an extremely useful zoom range. It allows you to go all the way from 17 millimeters, and the various points along the way are 20 millimeters, 24 millimeters, 28 millimeters, 35, and then 50 millimeters, as you can see along the sequence. What's interesting to me is that every single one of those corresponds to a fairly popular prime lens range. And so this is a lens that covers a lot of really important focal lengths in one zoom. As noted, we get the G2 level of build. And so this is nicer materials. Yes, it's still primarily engineered plastics, but it's more upgraded, a classier finish. There's a little bit more shape and design to the lens itself. It feels like a nicer built lens than what earlier generation Tamron lenses were. And beyond that, it does get some expanded features that we'll break down in just a moment. The lens itself is 74.8 millimeters in diameter, so it allows it to retain that 67 millimeter front filter thread that has been pretty much common for all of the Tamron lenses on Sony to this point, with the exception of some of the extreme examples like the 35-150 and then also the 150-500 millimeters. Those two lenses have larger filter sizes, but every other lens has a 67 millimeter filter size, so it's easy to share filters along all of this particular set of lenses. The lens is 114.5 millimeters in length. That's 4.5 inches, and it weighs in at 460 grams or 16.2 ounces. And so it's a moderately sized lens, kind of more of a slender lens than it is a squat one. And the weight is moderate. It feels like a little bit of a heft in the hand, but it's light enough that most people should be able to carry it most of the day without too many complaints. Beyond that, it does have a thorough weather sealing. And so that includes 8 different seal points internally, gasket at the lens mount, a flooring coating on the front element. So a professional grade of weather sealing, and of course the fact that it's internally zooming. A lot of people prefer that because they feel like there is less of an option for either dust or moisture to intrude, because nothing is extending in and out beyond the outer casing of the lens itself. It has 9 rounded aperture blades, and so that'll keep a circular shape up to, Tamron says, 2 stops beyond maximum aperture, so that gets us up to f8, and then after that you'll start to see a little bit of the aperture blades. So obviously that's useful. Now there is no traditional aperture ring here, but what we do have is under the customization, you do have the ability to get the focus ring to work as an aperture ring. More on that in just a moment. There is a custom button here on the side, and so you have the ability to just program that through the camera body, much like you would Sony's focus hold button. But through using the also included USB-C port, that is weather sealed, by the way. And so while it's exposed, it is sealed, and so you're not going to get moisture or dust intrusion in there. But you can hook that up either to, by USB-C to either a PC, but then also to anything with a USB-C port. And so that could also be a tablet, and you can run either the app or the program called Tamron's Lens Utility. And that gives you a lot of different options on how to customize the lens. And so part of that includes more options for how you're going to customize that custom button, which would include, if you have it set up as I do at the moment, you can click it and switch between a focus ring or an aperture ring. And so it does give you back that extra measure of control if you prefer having something like an aperture ring. There's a lot of other functions you can assign to it as well. Beyond that, however, there's also some interesting options when it comes to the focused ring and its behavior. You have the ability to choose between a linear or non-linear focus. You can even choose the direction that the ring goes. And you can also choose how much focus throw or rotation there is, as little as 90 degrees, I believe, and as much as 360 degrees of rotation. So a lot of direct control over that, which does again lend itself to the functionality of this as a video type lens. I will also say that the feel of the manual focus ring is good. It has, I would say, the appropriate amount of weight to where there's a little bit of resistance, and so you can make precise movements, but at the same time, it's not so heavy that there's any kind of sticking point or difficulty there. Now, because this is an internally zooming design, it really is great for using on a gimbal. Once you've set up the balance for it at any particular focal length, you can change that focal length with the balance point staying the exact same. And so that means that I could shoot at various actual focal lengths while having it on the gimbal and not worry about any kind of rebalancing, which is another reason to strongly prefer an internally zooming design for video work. But even for stills, it means that you have a very, very smooth and quick ability to zoom throughout there, and it just has kind of a feel to it that's hard to emulate in a externally zooming lens where something is moving in and out. Now, like many of Tamron's recent zooms, we have a varying minimum focus distance depending upon whether we're at the wide or the telephoto end. On the telephoto end is actually where you get your highest magnification, and minimum focus distance is still only 30 centimeters there. And it gives you a very useful right over 0.26 times of magnification. And so there's going to be a lot of different applications for that. And again, as a video lens, it means that you can get quite close to your subject without worrying about passing that minimum focus distance. And And of course, if you're at the wide end, it means that you can get really literally within about 3 inches of the front of the lens, and it will still focus down that closely. So obviously that's going to be useful. I found that up close results varied a little bit. Contrast seemed to be reduced in some situations, but in others it did quite well. But nonetheless, this is certainly a useful application for the lens. Now, as noted in our introduction, autofocus comes via Tamron's top-tier focus system at this point, and that is their VXD, which stands for Voice Coil Extreme Torque Drive. In other words, it's a high-powered linear motor. And in this case, we have really great focus speed. As you can see here, focus speed is pretty much instantaneous as you go from one extreme to the other. I didn't hear any kind of noise in operation. Focus transitions are smooth and confident. I found that I could track Nala on the move for both stills, which I can't always do, by the way. It takes a very reactive lens to be able to get up that amount of speed just to kind of track that persistent, aggressive movement on a small object. But also I found for video, as you can see in the sequence, that it stayed really just perfectly. I was kind of backing away as quickly as I could from her as she persistently came before me. And you can see that the video kept tracking her perfectly at that point. I would say that when it came to autofocus for stills, I had zero issues at all. Autofocus was just excellent in all situations, and the same is true really for video as well. I found that for vlogging, for example, I had very strong accuracy, keeping it locked on my face without any kind of issue, moving around with a varying background, no issue with that. When I did focus pulls, you can see there is next to no focus breathing. So it means that focus changes are just very, very smooth. They're very quick, but it's basically just a matter of something else seeming to be in focus. You don't hardly see any kind of transition between the two focus points. The same was true when it came to my hand test, that very easy transitions back and forth from the hand to the eye, all went well there. And then out in just kind of real world video shots, you can see, for example, in this sequence that as I transition from one subject to another, there's nothing abrupt or jarring. All of those transitions are quite good. And so again, a very, very useful lens in video applications. The one criticism I will say is that this lens is not parfocal. I kind of hoped that it would be, but there is quite a difference between what is in focus at 50 millimeters and what would be in focus at 17 millimeters and vice versa. Beyond that minor complaint, however, I give very, very high marks to this lens for its autofocus performance. So let's talk about image quality then. As you can see here, the MTF charts, particularly at 17 millimeters, are really, really strong. 50 millimeters strong as well, but not quite as strong over in the corners. You can see that in the center of the frame, it is very, very sharp, resolving at a very high level. And so we'll just break down to see if that's what we actually see in real world use, and then also in my specific, more scientific test.
So we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. As you can see, there is, at 17 millimeters is where we get the bad news. There is a significant amount of barrel distortion and also a significant amount of vignette. Furthermore, as you can see here on the right side, if you try to manually correct for it, it doesn't correct all that cleanly. It's not a linear distortion, and so as a byproduct, we have a definite mustache pattern left behind after correction. Now here's a look at a JPEG. There isn't a raw profile yet, but the JPEG shows that the in-camera correction does a much better job with the distortion. The lines are a lot cleaner. It's not perfect, but it certainly is a lot better looking. Now I have manually corrected with a plus 44, which is definitely on the high side of the distortion. And then vignette, I've had to nearly max out the sliders to try to correct for the vignette. So there is a lot of both. To put that into perspective, however, while the vignette isn't as bad on the Sony lens, the distortion is actually worse still. And it was a similarly complex kind of distortion. So even at 20 millimeters, the 20 to 70G had even more distortion. It was over a 50 to correct for it. And it definitely left a similar mustache pattern behind. Now the good news is that the distortion at 28 millimeters and then at 50 millimeters is altogether different. It's just a very mild amount of pincushion distortion. At 50 millimeters, there was really nothing to correct, only about a -2 at 28 millimeters. And the vignette drops to where it only requires about a stop of correction versus the nearly 4 stops at 17 millimeters. So we only have a distortion problem and a vignette problem at the very wide end of the lens. Now, when I tested on my chart, you can see a little bit of green fringing here after the plane of focus. Because of the nature of the focal length and maximum aperture combination, there will be very few real-world situations where you'll encounter the longitudinal type chromatic aberration, so probably not a real-world factor. A bigger problem would be the lateral chromatic aberration that comes near the edges of the frame. Fortunately, that's very well controlled here. You can see that we have zero issue in the transitions from black to white near the edge of the frame. We'll take a look at our overall resolution and contrast, starting at 17mm f4. This is 200% magnification and a 61 megapixel Sony a7R Mark V. So definitely a torture test, but in the middle of the frame, we can see a near perfect result. A very high resolution, very high contrast. Mid-frame also looks excellent. And if we pan down here towards the corner, we can see that even the corners at 17mm look very good. Stopping down to f5.6 gives us just a little bit more contrast that will mostly show up towards the edges of the frame. And our peak performance comes here at f8. And we can see if we pop around different places in the frame that we've got good centering, a good performance here on the left side. Up in the upper left corner, we can see that it looks good as well. In the edge, very, very crisp. And up into this right corner, we have a nice performance there as well. Now after f8, we're going to see diffraction will start to become a factor, and by the time we get to the minimum aperture of f22, we can see we've lost a lot of contrast and resolution due to the effects of diffraction. So I would go as far as f11 here, but anything beyond that I would probably avoid. Now, if we move on to 20mm and compare back to the high water mark of 17mm, we can see in the middle of the frame, 20mm is, if anything, just a little bit better. A really strong performance there. Mid-frame is similarly looking really, really excellent, perhaps even a bit better than what we saw at 17mm. But if we go all the way down to the corner, we can see that that advantage is lost. It's not resolving as highly, though we can see due to reduced vignette in the corner, we do see a brighter image in the corner. As before, we can see some improvement at f5.6 and just a bit more at f8. Now 28mm is quite similar with a very good center performance that gets a little bit better when stopped down to f5.6 on the right. The mid-frame is probably just a little worse at f4. It comes back up to about the same level if stopped down to f5.6. But the corners don't look quite as good as what we have seen at wider focal lengths. Left side looks a little bit better, but it's not as good as what we have seen previously. 35mm, the center is maybe just a little bit softer, though as you can see it does sharpen up some when stopped down. But we see that the mid-frame is actually really strong even at f4, looking better still at f8. And the corners are definitely a lot better than what we saw at 28mm, for example. The corner performance here, particularly when stopped down, is actually very, very strong. So at the telephoto end of the zoom range, we can see that the center is looking very nice again. Stopping it down gives us more detail and contrast. Mid-frame is strong and gets a little bit better still when stopped down. And we can see that in the corners are fairly good, wide open, very crisp when stopped down. And so this is a pretty consistent performance across the zoom range. We can see here even wide open, 50mm f4, that in this kind of sweet spot, if we zoom into a pixel level, you can see just how incredibly crisp and detailed the image is. And the bokeh is probably helped a little bit by the fact that this was a foggy day, which makes it look really, really soft in the background. As we'll see in a moment, bokeh isn't quite this good, but certainly resolution and contrast is. We can see here that the bokeh is, fairly good in this zone right here. In the transition zone, there's a little bit more edging than what I would like, but we can also see that colors look great and the detail on the subject is really fantastic. As noted before, in some up-close situations like this one here, contrast is a little bit softened here at close focus distances. I will note that the bokeh actually looks quite nice here. In this situation, I think contrast obviously is held up a lot better up close. Though you can see that along the edges, there's a little bit of loss of contrast there. Bokeh looks pretty decent here, but there definitely is a little bit of outlining that I would prefer not to see. Now, in some situations where you don't have a favorable ratio from the subject to the background, backgrounds are going to be a little bit busy. That's just the nature of having a maximum focal length of 50 millimeters and a maximum aperture of only f4. Upside is that detail on the subject looks really nice here, and so overall it's a good looking image. Obviously, for real-world work, this lens delivers a lot of detail and really nice color. And I know that this image right here seems almost oversaturated. That actually is accurate to the colors I got right before a stormy day. So before the sun had risen over the horizon, the colors were just intense. This day, obviously, more muted colors due to the overall haze of the day. But you can see as we poke in here that the detail everywhere is just really gorgeous. This is a lens that offers a lot in terms of its resolution and its color as well. This image to me just really shows off the great color saturation levels of the lens, and of course then the detail as well. Looking even at 100% magnification, we can see that there's just tons of detail inside the frame. This being a very overcast kind of day, so not a day for colors to pop, and yet I do think that there is really nice color and contrast in this particular image that shows that this is definitely a lens capable of producing high-end results. So finally, let's talk about flare resistance for a moment. This has the Tamron second generation B-bar coatings, so G2 coatings. And you can see that whether it is wide open or stop down, contrast holds up really well. And so if we pan across the sun for video shooting at f4, you can see that there's very little there in terms of ghosting and no loss of contrast. And even when stop down, if we do the same, there's a little bit more of a pattern there, but it's very faint. This is a very good lens when it comes to its overall flare resistance. So overall, outside of heavy distortion and vignette at 17 millimeters, this is a very strong optical performance.
So in conclusion, this is a very interesting lens. I see it as an interesting lens for travel applications, much like the Sony 20 to 70 millimeter. I did travel with that lens and found it very useful as a travel lens. And I can see this being similarly useful. Not quite as much telephoto reach, but of course, having that extra 3 millimeters on the wide end means that, perhaps when you're shooting interior spaces or landscape scenes, city scenes, you'll be able to get just a little bit more in the frame. And if you're shooting on a higher resolution body, you can always crop in if you want more reach there. It's also, I think, an even more intriguing lens than what the Sony was for video work, however. That internally zooming design and the ability to go wider means that it's more useful for vlogging. It's just more useful for more video applications. And it also comes in at $400 less than what the Sony does. That makes it a really great bang for the buck lens. And what an amazing time it is to be on Sony at this point and to have these lenses available for so many different applications. And what's even better is that it seems like now we're starting to see Nikon Z or Z development for Tamron, and so I suspect this lens will show up in a Z mount in the near future. And Canon is finally making some noises that maybe in 2024 they'll start to open up to third-party development. So it could be that we even see this lens on an RF mount in the future. I would genuinely love it there because frankly, I'm not enamored with any of the existing wide-angle options on Canon RF right now. So I would really love to see it on that application as well. At the end of the day, however, on Sony FE, which is where we're first launching and reviewing here, we are so spoiled for choice at this point, and this is another very good option. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my text review, to an image gallery, buying links there. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.